Although I'd spontaneously narrate my story about Dinkytown and the West Bank, there are enough threads to weave together that I wouldn't want to forget one getting carried away with another. So I've written down my account, which I plan to read. And it's location, location, evocation is this page. Right from the start of its development, the West Side would be the downtown business district. Oh, let me begin. It was natural that the U of M campus in Dinkytown would become the cradle of Minneapolis's counterculture. Right from the start of its development, the West Side would be the downtown business district, and the East Side would hold the University of Minnesota. I've studied the history of Minneapolis, and that's literally what happened. The area of southeast and northeast was originally the town of St. Anthony, or St. Anthony Falls, as it was sometimes listed. And the U there attracted the largest body of students, educators, and free thinkers to its spacious campus, removed from the vigorous commercial activity of West Side downtown. St. Anthony and Minneapolis merged into the latter in 1872. The residential architecture of Southeast was undisturbed from its pioneer founding, and its Civil War-era Victorian houses created an atmosphere of protection, charm, and culture. Separated from the rapid mercantile expansion across the river, where fine houses over there were frequently demolished and supplanted, the old houses around campus still stood. By the mid-20th century, the leisurely off-campus pace had welcomed restaurants, bars, shops, theaters, bookstores, and coffee houses. Poets, beatniks, and after-hour party-goers swarmed its streets in the late 50s, and then the folk and blues music revival built on the momentum in the early 60s. Red Nelson's 10 O'Clock Scholar in Dinkytown and Mel Leslie's blues coffee house, The Coffee Break, next to the campus theater in Stadium Village, were the axis of music. 1961. University High School in Dinkytown marinated younger students in college ambience, and a senior named Dave Ray started performing Leadbelly and other blues on a 12-string guitar, which sounded like the authentic idiom, along with the harmonica played by Tony Glover. And I thought, well, I don't know whether anyone else has mentioned this latest collection of Dave Ray, but Tony Glover, wrote the narration, and, he described the same period of time I'm describing. When I first met Dave, he had just graduated from high school. This was 1961, and was getting quite a rep as a purveyor of stompy, funky leadbelly music. Well, it goes on, in the fall of 1961, Dave started college aiming at a pre-med track. After a couple of months, he realized that wasn't for him and split for New York's Greenwich Village. Long story short, he met up there with John Kerner, and when they all came back to Minneapolis, they started playing at the Coffee Break, and that's kind of where I'm taking up the narrative, because I used to come over from Northeast. I'd walk along Johnson to get to Dinkytown, and I'd go through all these nice houses. It's very soothing, it used to be a lot more soothing because there were fewer people, and it was really sleepy, but anyway, my destination wasn't so much the Scholar, although I went in there and, it was okay, but there were always new people. Whereas at the Coffee Break over in Stadium Village, there were largely no people. Mel had a coffee house, well, I'll just go on to describe it. But, let's see, can I do that now? I think I'll get back to it. I'm going to go into a bit of autobiography, since this is the beginning and it's 1961. I was born at Fairview Hospital September 30th, 1945. That was the day that wartime ended, which was like daylight savings time during the war. And my mother's parents lived in the Longfellow neighborhood on 36th Avenue and 33rd Street South. My parents divorced when I was 2, and my mother and I moved to Northeast. But before that, you know, a little backstory. What I realized in having visits with me and my comrades from the West Bank was that we never asked each other personal questions in the beginning. We just did everything together and became, you know, very close friends. But in these parties I've attended in recent years, I've come to realize that, gee, I don't know anything about them. I don't know what their parents did, or so that's why I thought I'd read this. My mother dropped out of South High to ride the rails out west in the early 30s, where she modeled at Walt Disney Studio. She was like a beatnik, to say the least. I mean, in essence. She traveled to Baton Rouge and modeled at Louisiana State University, where she met my father, Ralph McKenzie, an art student from Shreveport, Louisiana. He was a graduate student with Thomas Hart Benton in Kansas City when Dorothy and Ralph got married in 1939. He became a metals designer in the Army, and after the war they moved to Minneapolis, where he worked at Flower City Ornamental Iron in South Minneapolis. He continued to paint and remained influential in my life, visiting and teaching me every 3 weeks. That was his parental visitation. And Dorothy was an artist too, who encouraged my skill in various crafts, so I did a lot of hobbies growing up. And she paid for improvisational acting classes for me at the U, and bought me a banjo and a guitar, and I became a folk singer. She shared her love of writing and modern literature with me, worked as an editorial proofreader for her occupation. I attended Edison High in Saturday morning art classes at the art school. It was called the art school back in those days. A girl in my painting class was engaged to a blues guitarist named Bill Gleason, and in the winter of '61, she took me to meet him one morning at the coffee break. He had been sleeping in Mel Leslie's closet in the second floor room above the coffee house, and since the break, that's what we called it, wasn't open in the day, we had the place to ourselves. Compared to the Scholar's storefront in the heart of 14th and 4th Street in Dinkytown, the coffee break was not a conventional-looking business. It was a regular 2-story frame house set back on a lot next to the campus theater, and you'd reach it by climbing a wooden staircase on the front lawn. It had been a coffee house called the Bastille before Mel bought it when he left the Air Force. Mel and Red were born in 1937 and 1939, respectively. They're both, 9 and 6 years older than me. Red and Mel, they were part of the biker scene as well as Seven Corners bar scene at the mixers and rent parties that Red sponsored on the West Bank, besides being coffee house owners. The coffee break was like a private hipster cave few tourists dared to enter. Its walls were papered in burlap, its ceiling hung with thick fish netting holding colored glass ball weights like they use in fishing. And the windows held transported stained glass panels above mosaic top tables crafted by Mel and his mother. They also made the ceramic cups and mugs that went with the coffee and cider. She baked brownies every day, and the place was imbued with the wonderful aroma of espresso, cinnamon sticks, hot cider, brownies, and tobacco. Mel had created the interior decoration, which would later get transferred to the New Riverside Cafe. So Mel actually created the New Riverside Cafe as well as the coffee break. But the guy is so humble and modest compared to, us kids. It was that way after the New Riverside opened, too. He just kept a very low profile. And as a result, people don't even know this, or, didn't after a while. But he found that site on Riverside and 19th Avenue in the mid-'60s. He had to move because they put in a fast food restaurant where the old coffee break was. Anyway, after meeting Mel later that day, he looked at my artwork from the art class and agreed to let me put some pieces up alongside the antique musical instruments hanging on the walls. That's how it was decorated with my artwork and instruments. He let me manage and perform weekends at the second coffee house he owned called the Here. that was even more successful than the break. He had like, well...
H-E-A-R or H-E-R?
No, just H-E-R-E here.
Okay.
It was on Oak and Washington, right around the corner. Many of the musicians who comprised the later West Bank stable of performers played and held court at the coffee break, and I and other acts had mostly the here to play, and it was more, commercial. Mel was really keen on what we all called ethnic folk music, whether it was or not. Music that was serious and not just like the Kingston Trio, which was more like what I was doing. Well, we did it well. I had a trio, but I was also a solo performer. I would perform Ewan McCall Scottish ballads, and Clancy Brothers things. I had Celtic, McKenzie. But the fact is that entire scene that we thought of as the West Bank was in its fulfillment in Dinkytown. Well, in Dinkytown too, but I can only speak for the coffee break. It was where Dylan came when he came back from New York. And he was close friends with Dave and Tony, and so that was that story. John Kerner, Judy Larson, Willie Murphy, and Bob Dylan were joined by the numerous traveling musicians that would follow in from the circuit. Mel introduced me to Bob Dylan in the spring of 1962 when he had just cut his first album for Columbia and was back for his first visit back from New York. And I took peyote that summer, and inspired by Dylan's travels, I hitched a ride to San Francisco and performed in North Beach coffee houses. That was fun. I could have stayed out there too. It was a foretaste of what was coming to San Francisco. All the kids that I met were like proto-hippies, and I had long hair too, not shoulder-length hair, but we were trying to be beatniks and became hippies.
It's a great one.
My senior year in high school, the Tyrone Guthrie Theater opened, and I was hired as an usher and then as an extra. So I got that experience. I could have continued to happily make my scene here, but I had won a scholarship to study painting at the art school in Washington University in St. Louis. My father drove me down there just before JFK was killed. I'd acted with Harold Ramis at the Guthrie, and he attended Washington U with me as well. Harold Ramis, the late director and writer. Career in comedy, we talked about, had a lot of appeal for me. I worked in the children's theater troupe in St. Louis, as well as acted in the university theater, and I sang musicals. I had an active musical career. But I also took a lot of LSD in college and sold pot to other hippies in school. A fellow actor named John McIntyre and I became friends, and we theorized about a new kind of improvisational theater we called life acting. And it was basically inventing your own protagonist, yourself, off the stage, but we would use all the things we had learned from acting. He was a very great actor and continued to do it. And of course, that's a lot of what the street theater of the Haight-Ashbury was about too. People, doing their own scripts as they went along, and then seeing if listening to themselves, seeing if it sounded good. The same things that you find in coffee houses everywhere, but it was really intense. Things were a lot different then. So many things that we did were illegal. LSD was illegalized, and it changed everything. But although I graduated in 1967 with a degree in painting, I had more or less quit playing music because of the Beatles and Dylan, and I covered them, but I wanted to do my own material, and if I couldn't, I didn't want to do any, and it takes a lot of energy to do drugs and be a hippie, so that's what happened. I decided to join John after I got out of school, and we communed together in the autumn of 1967. when I got out there. It was sort of the autumn of love rather than the start of it. Let's see. Yeah. John was an immensely personable Leo who helped run the family dog shows in the Avalon until hooking up with the Grateful Dead. He became their most influential manager, and communing together in the Haight-Ashbury, I loaned him the use of my car in exchange for a comprehensive crash course in the history and organization of the hippies. So I lived there for 3 years, and I could digress, and you know, if this was about the Haight-Ashbury, I could you know, tell you all about it. I got to meet the band, of course, but others as well, and also the promoter, Bill Graham, the poster artists, the diggers, and original communal publicists like Mary Ellen Luce, who taught me the essential hippie arts of astrology, tarot, I Ching, God's eye making, beading, and embroidery, all of which I brought back with me when I left. I went on a psychedelic bus tour of western rural communes out to a remote settlement in northern New Mexico near Taos, where I spent most of 1968. When I returned to the city, I worked as a sandal maker at a hip store on 8th Street and then founded my own craft commune a few blocks away. We produced gem-studded ornate leather book covers. I guess I do have one of those that might appear. This is not, you know, the format. Each one I make is different, but John commissioned these for the Grateful Dead. They like to give each other gifts, and so that's mostly what we did, but I also, well, we produced gem-studded ornate leather book covers commissioned by McIntyre, and a full line of clothing, hats, wristbands, headbands, belts, pouches, and bags, as well as paintings, staves, jewelry, and murals. Custom made for individuals or consigned to the various stores on 8th Street. It was primarily a spiritual-based collective, and its members anointed and crowned me Aquarius on February 12, 1969. I decided to live outdoors to fully embrace the whole psychedelic scene while in its heyday. I practiced being an earthbound astronaut as the moon landing took place that July, and continued taking notes in the daily journal format I've used for 50 years. I also began my private poetry creation there too. I've written thousands of poems no one has ever written or read. No one. I lived in an ashram that autumn and winter, and then I returned to Minneapolis March 4th, 1970. That's where I can just pick up the story because, well, what I realized was that I thought I had learned so much in San Francisco, but when I came back to Minneapolis, you know, the coffee break no longer existed, and I would hitchhike over from Franklin Avenue over to the West Bank to paint. I did streetscapes, new realist streetscapes of Richter's Corner and Five Corners Bar, and then the Riverside opened. Just, you know, one day I noticed that it was open, and a neighbor of mine on Franklin Avenue had already volunteered to work there. It was a first-come, first-serve deal. Whereas, you know, if you felt right and you wanted a job, you could work at the Riverside. But we didn't know what it was. We didn't know what kind of menu we would serve, or all we did know is we had the greatest availability of musicians you could ask for, you know, far greater than anything previously. And so I began by making their signs and also doing the posters that became a feature, as well as calendars. And I wasn't the only one. As time went by, but we're talking about things that were like, you know, posters of days, and then calendar pictures of the months. And I also collected the cover charge, you know. It was generally like everyone did everything, but, you know, we didn't need everyone to collect covers, so I became a little more specialized in that way than others. And then also, I liked to fancy that it was individualistic, so I could do what I saw needed to be done if things needed you know, to be picked up or, you know, just as a utility worker. We all began, or about 30 of us, that met Monday nights to discuss how it was going and, you know, how it was shaping up. And the next month, Cafe opened in September, and October 21st, exactly a year after Jack Kerouac's death.
Mm-hmm.
We founded the collective, the New Riverside Cafe Collective, because Bill Teska had let Ralph, you know, run the management since he was managing the music, but he didn't feel like he was any, well, he didn't want to be a leader, even though he made a very good leader. And we just decided it would be simplest if we all, you know, were the boss. So, you know, that's how it started. And then that's what I kept track of in this book that I've rewritten from the journals of the day. Again, I wasn't going to do more than indicate this, but I called it Pictograph, and it's a diary of the first 6 months, every day of the first 6 months. A lot of the people lived in apartments above the building, so we always had their places to go to. But the key thing about the collective was that we wanted to live together, live collectively, and live communally. So that's what set us apart from the other co-ops. We were all but entirely communal, and 8 of us got a house on 8th Street by the park there, Riverside Park. And it made it a lot easier to, you know, fill our shifts and move around and do what we did. It's funny, though, this wasn't meant to be read by anyone. It was just in my habit. I started writing a journal in New Mexico and continued in the same way, just, you know, writing down what happened that day. So it's very subjective. It's mostly things that I did, but it also included everything that everyone else did. So it's valuable, but I don't think it's a commercial property by any means. Anyway, the first 6 months were probably the most dramatic because the people that went on playing for years first began playing there. We became a strong source of bluegrass music, as well as Dave Ray's blues and Willie Murphy and different groups of musicians who played in bands, really in the Bumblebees, or the West Bank Trackers was all girls rock group, folk rock, and I got to see all of it for free, you know, sitting, I mean, it was the best job in the world, and, you know, we didn't charge any more than 50 cents or at most $1 to get in and stay all evening. We were trying to build a business, you know, in essence. The only money we made, we divided equally, or we aimed for each member achieving $30 a week as our spending money. And that went on for years. That was, and you'd write down, you know, you could take a draw from the till and write down what you took and what it was for. And, you know, I started to say I thought I knew a lot more than I did. But in 1970, for example, I didn't know that America had reached the point of peak oil, that we suddenly no longer had our own oil supply, but would be needing to rely more and more on imported oil. And then, you know, in 1971, Richard Nixon took America off the gold standard. He had been borrowing so much money for the war in Vietnam that we didn't have the gold to back up our cash anymore. So we haven't been on the gold standard since 1971, August. And naturally, we were approaching $1 trillion in debt when Reagan took office, and now we're $20 trillion in debt. So it's pretty hard to imagine that America isn't bankrupt and that the entire, you know, financial structure based on the American dollar isn't going to really suffer a collapse at some point, probably sooner than later. Anyway, when I think back on those days, what Minneapolis was like in 1970 and everything that's developed since, I would say that population growth has had a lot to do with what happened on the West Bank. The Riverside was up against, well, we had to be demolished. The first New Riverside Cafe on 19th and Riverside, that's what it looked like, was raised to make a parking lot, you know, like Joni Mitchell saw. And it just kept going that way. All of our customers were being evicted too. Heller and Siegel had been buying up the property since 1963, anything they could quietly get their hands on. So they had whole blocks that they could tear down to build the high-rise. And it became the kind of main phenomenon that we were rallying around, not just the Riverside Cafe, but the entire neighborhood, how to stay intact, because otherwise the expiration date was only a year or so away. We watched them build the high-rises that they did. But it was just insane. It was the opposite of what we had moved there for. It would be, if there was a theme, and is a theme, it's the undebated question of, you know, the quality of life when you have high density rather than high community. You know, and I think that's what the story is, both in Dinkytown and the West Bank, that you can't just, well, there isn't a store where you can go out and buy a community. A community is an organic thing. And as I myself had ridden from Northeast to South Minneapolis on my bike when I was a kid, over and over again, I would go through the West Bank. So I knew what it was like back in the 50s. And, you know, my parents or my mother and her parents are Scandinavian or Swedish, so, you know, I've always had that connection and regarded the West Bank as my community too. My grandfather had worked there when he was a boy, and, you know, memories went back 100 years, basically. And they were just going to sweep it aside for profit. You know, you could cram so many people and get them to pay so much more if you put them in, you know, high-rises. And even though it eventually became the set for the last season of the Mary Tyler Moore show, you know, she lived in Cedar Square West.
She did?
Yeah, yeah, it was on TV that whole final year. And, well, it was a battle of values, you know. Back in 1970, not only was pot and LSD illegal, but so was living together. Unmarried couples weren't able to rent apartments. That was part of the communal living thing, see? So, you know, you don't notice changes because they happen so gradually, but if you think about it, the changes that have taken place have been really quite enormous, and they all seem to be unable to stop the growth of gentrification. It's just a blind policy. If you can't get any more money out of an old building, tear it down, build a new one, cheaper, and get a lot more money for it. And that's what had happened in downtown Minneapolis with the so-called Gateway District. This is the story of the destruction of 40% of downtown Minneapolis had already occurred, and those of us who were natives saw it go down. You know, it didn't happen in a month or so. It happened over a few years, but after leveling that much of downtown, they didn't rebuild it. It just sat there, and it was an eyesore for years and years. Well, certainly during my high school years, it was just a bunch of empty lots, and so community meant a great deal to us. The idea of having a scene, and Dinkytown we had already been moved out of, basically, so the West Bank became the last refuge that was appropriate for hippies to feel comfortable. And that went on for a long time. The first few years of the West Bank wasn't like the kind of boutique shopping area that it became later. It was just old buildings like the Holtzerman building and Richter's drugstore and the bottom of Dania Hall, and Edna's Cafe. A few things did survive, but for the most part, by the time that the West Bank became a location, that was all new businesses that had gotten their start because we managed to keep Heller Siegel from tearing everything down. And that story of what makes a community was in miniature what the collective was. It was an experiment every day, every week, and how people get along equally. And it was amazing to go to a meeting that didn't have any chairperson or format. We'd all just sit in a circle, usually have some beer to drink, pot to smoke, and the meeting would evolve of its own. People would listen to each other voluntarily. No one tried to interrupt. Views were different, but we agreed we needed some collective philosophy, and so we all started reading in anarchism. There were books on anarchism. We all had a kind of collective library going there at the cafe, not just of music albums. This one was The Essential Works of Anarchism by Marshall Schatz, and we were serious. We didn't know what it was. You kind of knew, but the fact is that anarchism as a philosophy, has a very definite history and pioneers. And, well, anyway, so we decided that was where it was at. The book by Max Stirner is called Union of Egoists, and his individual anarchism was ideal for us. It was just like, you do your own thing, and you would be surprised how easily you can find some third thing to agree about if there's some disagreement of two things. So we could sidestep arguing needlessly, and instead we ended up doing other things besides run the cafe. The collective moved pianos and fixed trucks, and we had a whole slew of activities. We called that part of it the Dire Wolf Gang. Dire Wolf after a song by the Grateful Dead. What happened to me was San Francisco got pretty hairy by the end of 1969. Manson and, any number of things were making the scene darker and darker. And so coming back to Minneapolis, what I had hoped to do was recreate my own experience in Haight-Ashbury, but on a smaller scale where you could actually know everyone. I got to know a lot of people over the years in San Francisco, but you could never know everybody. There are thousands of strangers, so it worked out very, very nicely. The people that created the collective were not all hippies by any means, but they were, anyway. And that scene developed organically just through our daily interactions and conversations, of course, and it's hard to believe that something so valuable would end up getting so attenuated, but when you realize that the cafe stayed open for 27 years, you could raise children, and that's of course what was happening with the hippies. We were going into our own families. The people who started the cafe became parents, and suddenly that's going to dominate your attention far more than getting along with a bunch of strange people your own age. But for a while, in this golden period, you could see how an entire country could run voluntarily if the people respected each other, and you had the means of, like you could now through computer interaction, you could vote yourself rather than having a representative vote for you. And we want to have, real democracy, not just representative democracy. And we succeeded at that for a long time. And the thing is, though, that population of one sort or another keeps on intruding. In this case, the existence of everything else, all the straight businesses in Minneapolis had their pressure applied to us. People came from the newspaper to find out what was going on, as if it was so complicated. But sometimes the simplest things work the best. And where it began to go wrong was in all the meetings that we had to attend. We formed a political action committee. The PAC took up more and more and more time. People became somewhat fascinated by meeting with downtown bigwigs and trying to figure out how to work out this compromise. So when 1975 rolled along, just 5 years after it started, there were two competing co-ops serving the food co-ops in the neighborhood. And we had what ended up being a co-op war between the two co-ops, even with lead pipes and violence. So for the first time, the people at the Riverside were asked to vote for which one we wanted to patronize. And we had never voted. That was the main thing, you know, no need to vote because we were always in agreement. We could always get to agreement. So that's when a lot of us left. Ralph Whitkoff started Durable Goods next door, and I worked for a roadhouse in St. Paul called the River Serpent. It was located on the Raspberry Island underneath the Wabasha Bridge. We had that going for a couple of years, and Willie Murphy was the house band, and it was like a alcohol-based coffee house. But they say all good communes come to an end, and so that's always what happens. Minneapolis's birthday as Pisces, March 1st birthday, and that degree is interpreted as curtailment, 13 degrees Pisces, and it seems like curtailment is a definite part of our story here. I mean, everything that we start ends, whether it should or not. The fact is that the remodeling of the West Bank is a destination, a shopping destination and entertainment destination, should have enabled it to keep going and growing indefinitely. But that wasn't to be the case. It was almost like it was fated to slip out of our hands as its own success got the better of it. We reached a settlement with Hiller Siegel where local people got to redesign the what you call, this is called, the subtitle of the book about it is called The Struggle for Alternative Redevelopment in Cedar Riverside. This was a book written by a student from Temple University in 1994. The Riverside had three more years to go before the demographics changed so much that we couldn't keep the business going. Indeed, I say we, but I was just a visitor for its later years. And, well, when this book was written, it seemed to have reached a happy ending. You know, people were employed to help with the redevelopment, but most of the people who had lived there had to move out of their houses. And in the interim, you know, they ended up staying wherever they had to move to. And I don't know, it didn't feel like the same place anymore. But in the meantime, the cafe had become a famous vegetarian restaurant. And not just that, but it continued to be a completely comfortable place to hang out. And, you know, you could stay there all day if you wanted to. I mean, no one was in charge because we were all in charge. You know? So, anyway, eventually the fatal error was, for the Riverside, was buying the building. It wasn't enough to be worker managed, they wanted it to be worker owned. And so even as the demographics were changing and our Somali friends were moving in and the neighborhood was becoming an ethnic Somali neighborhood, they weren't going to be shopping at the Riverside, and it just kept going that way until we couldn't pay our bills. Owning the building ended up being fatal, and thankfully I wasn't around to see it. And a lot of the arguments that we would have waged in the beginning about what a collective was had changed utterly. You know, we're talking about different generations of people. When I was in San Francisco, I was 21, 22, 23, 24, but a large majority of the people were the youngsters that, later became punks. You know, the hippie movement morphed into the punk movement, and all that happened on the West Bank too. So that the older people went off to start their families, and younger people just didn't have the same interest. It was a going concern. There was no reason to start it. It had already started and was carrying on just fine. In subsequent years, we've tried to do, there is a website, and there had been a newsletter briefly, but you would have a hard time making a go of those things without the active daily interaction of people. You're not going to cook anything on the internet, but that's what we had become pretty good at, I think. The food was always enjoyed and was healthy, and that's probably the thing that's most missed about it, besides the music. But in my opinion, the changing demographics naturally changed the community. A community is the people that live in it, and when you change the people, you change the sense of community. The subsequent years have brought about this kind of interest in Northeast Minneapolis. We're not covering that in this research project. Hopefully the neighborhood will remain intact and not be subject to the same kind of gentrification, because a lot of these houses have, stayed in good repair over the years, and single-family homes are pretty unassailable. So in time there'll be enough hip, so-called people here, and it'll be like the West Bank, I would think, but not for a while. Now everyone is like an artist, and using terms like mid-career artist and things like that. But it's, from my viewpoint, a narrower interest. I love it. I'm glad so many artists are living here, but they're not street people in the same way that musicians are. And you don't see them on the street. They stay in their studios. You can go to the studios and look around, and it's very inspiring, but not like the idea that I found so attractive about the hippies that I wanted to be one. And that was that you didn't have to be an artist to be an artist. What made, all the hippies just thought they were artists. Why even question it? So the pretension of having a profession, of entering a division of labor kind of identity continues to be a mind boggle to those that haven't done it. And that's sort of what I regret the most, that we don't stop and look at our life as its own entertainment. Things are divided by the institutional system. We have government, schools, jobs, occupations, got the army, got prisons, religious institutions, but all of them are not really individual based. They're meant to deal with individuals, to handle individuals. And I think what we were into was some way of finding out how to live as individuals, to make that our profession, to be your own job. Certainly that was true out west. And it continues to be true, but as we all know, the needs of the other liberation movements, civil rights, women's lib, gay liberation, especially in San Francisco, the anti-war movement, all these things were much more important than the hippies to themselves, to the hippies too. I mean, we thought being able to reinvent ourselves was a really important idea, and we all enjoyed doing it, but we couldn't stop the rest of the world. We're like a drop in a bucket. So essentially the counterculture morphed into pop culture. They borrowed everything. They took our music, and now the music industry has gone through a huge change because of the internet. So people are essentially consumers, and whatever is the current thing becomes their culture.
Could you say a little bit more about street culture? That was intriguing.
Oh, yeah. I'd
love to hear more about that.
Okay. I should just go with questions. What I found was that the whole scene in San Francisco, the Haight-Ashbury, was really misdirected by or mischaracterized by the press. And the same here. They don't know, they don't go. They, people in the media are there as outsiders, and there were a few in San Francisco that changed that. A fellow came from Look magazine. Not only did a very sympathetic article for the magazine about the hate and the counterculture, but then he ended up staying and, you know, becoming a hippie himself to a degree. So it sort of, it takes one to know one, and you wouldn't know what life was like on the street unless you actually lived on the street. So that's what I decided to do when I first got there and saw what it was like. I mean, you're talking about thousands of people just, you know, on the street talking to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And you could make friends with 100 people a day if you wanted to, because everyone's stoned, and it would be like, you know, instant friendship. You got on a wavelength together, and you became like your oldest friends, you know. It was even more so, to talk about street culture would be the love-in or be-in phenomenon that we all participated in every weekend, actually all day, every day, but especially on the weekend. Golden Gate Park would fill up with between, well, say 2,000 and 5,000 people who would just go there to be with each other. There was no entertainment, there was no concert going on. You just lay out a blanket and sit in a huge group of people, and you could talk, you know, people would talk about things, but it was more a matter of grooving just on being there, soaking in the ambience, being able to spend time with other people, essentially doing nothing, having nothing better to do, intentionally having nothing better to do. It became the best thing that we did. And it's impossible to describe because, like, I've never seen a be-in or a love-in in Minneapolis. You know, you can have large crowds attend a concert, but that isn't it. It was recognizing that there were other people like yourself whose whole lives were ahead of them, in essence. The whole form of their life could be of their making. And there was something so delicious about that that it was irresistible. I mean, I went every weekend. You might say to show off. You know, everyone liked to portray the character they wanted to make of themselves. That was the genius of the thing. And like I mentioned, we would make clothing and other custom articles so people could have things they couldn't buy otherwise. I wish that were possible in more places. Obviously there were be-ins in New York and other large cities, but Minneapolis wasn't quite large enough to reach that critical mass where you...
What form did the street culture take in Minneapolis? What were the elements there that you saw?
I would say the fact that we lived in a neighborhood and we could visit each other just, you know, a few houses down. So, well, the street culture was the pathway. The destination was one another's private homes. It's so interesting to see how people live and, you know, not have a lot of self-importance or self-consciousness about sharing your life with your friends. And of course, smoking dope and drinking beer tied it all together all the time, you know. And we all took LSD and stuff. I mean, you know, everyone that worked at the Riverside when I was a part of it was certainly stoned, and we saw that you didn't lose control or go into some weird trip when you got high. We'd go in the basement and get high and come up and just have an easier time doing what we were doing, finding more enjoyment of emotion in it. So we'd, you know, stay on the street, go into shops, talk to each other. But with the Riverside there, that could, you know, house a lot of people at one time. And the extempore, I didn't even mention that, but I was also a part of the extempore. The way that Mel was able to open the place, he couldn't get permission from the city to open what he would have called the Last Stand Coffee House. So Bill Teska came in with West Bank Campus Ministries, and having already run the extemp, and knowing that they were going to tear down a lot of the stuff anyway, the city acquiesced and let us have the license. They gave us a new location on Cedar and Riverside, right there on the corner, and we fixed it up, you know, continued the same style of interior design that Mel had thought of. And I'd say it worked out really, really well. Mel died a few months ago, and he was 77, and I introduced him to his partner the last 12 years, dancer. My partner was a dancer anyway. Mel and I have stayed in touch over the years, but we especially became close at the end of his life, and His partner lived in Northeast, so I could walk there. And I got to spend all the time that I wanted to with Mel when he was bedridden. He was suffering from heart failure. And it sort of tied everything together for me. Mel never changed. He remained partly biker, partly gun collector and weapons collector. That was also something we had in common. My father was one of the largest Civil War collectors in the area. And so he and Mel saw each other that way. And as before my father left town, when I went to college, he went out to Pennsylvania and ended up in Long Island doing that, collecting and writing. He was an illustrator. He could illustrate Civil War uniforms. That's a whole field. Anyway, Mel was a multifaceted guy who never defined himself strictly as a coffee house entrepreneur. But that's what he was more than anyone. And part of why I wanted to do this interview is to, as much as I can, make Mel Leslie a household term, a household name. I've got a picture. You can't see it very well, but I figured if you're going to talk about someone, there's this one. His hat's in his face, too. This is him sitting in the house he bought over on Portland and 42nd Avenue. Yeah. This is him more like in the, biker gear. But what I would pass along, this is secrets entrusted to a few. Mel's philosophy of life, his opinion of the world was that, quote, people are bullshit, unquote.
Goes along with coffee houses.
Yeah, very much so, very much so. It could stand as, the motto above the coffee house door. So you don't take yourself too seriously, and yet that's exactly what everyone did, of course, But those that were unsuccessful were the ones that you would say were bullshit. The main thing, back in those days, what I'm most fond of was the original coffee break that we called the break. Mel always called it the break. And although he got Reverend Gary Davis to play at the Here Coffee House, he had some pretty impressive visitors. The coffee break was just so darn cozy, and Dylan kept coming back. I mean, that wasn't the only time I met him. He would come and play tunes for Dave Ray in a little side room, and I remember being there with my senior year girlfriend saying, "There's Bob Dylan." And you could tell he heard me, and that they both enjoyed the idea of getting recognition from this crowd of, very small crowd of obscure nobodies, that we'd even know who they were, let alone, regard them as celebrities. But, Dylan kept coming back. He was around the extempore in '74. His album Planet Waves was written pretty much here and about us. One thing I could say, I don't know, it's all just spontaneous, but I made myself the publicist of the Riverside Cafe. I would send out our posters and other things that we were doing, other writings, usually to 100 different celebrities, the Beatles, the Stones, and I got feedback too. Yeah, everyone knew what we were doing. I mean, everyone that I sent this stuff to, I never got anything returned. I got positive feedback from Tom Wolfe. I got letters from him, letters from Ralph Gleason, of San Francisco's Chronicle. And so we had a feeling that we were communicating with everyone, and how the Grateful Dead connection went. They came up here, they were touring nationally, and I had my reunion with them, and, the cafe and all the people that we knew were Deadhead fans, so it was only natural that we would want to stay in communication. So when they were creating their independent record labels, Round Records and Grateful Dead Records, we helped them with that, and they helped us with our independent labels. We had a Eustace Hawk album, Bluegrass, and a comedy album put out in '73 called Music is Just a Bunch of Notes. Dave Ray and Kerner. And then when they came here to play in St. Paul in '73, the cafe wanted to have a party with them, and so I invited them. John was still my friend, and I knew the band members not as well as John, but so they agreed, and they came after the concert to party with us. My mother was the hostess in that free store, above the free store. And we jammed all night, mostly bluegrass, because of Jerry Garcia's interest in bluegrass, and there are any number of banjo players in the collective. So it was like a banjo jam, but you'd see Bob Weir talking in a corner with Haps and showing them things, and the only sour note the whole evening was Tony Legos saying, "Well, we just really love the Grateful Dead," which is an Elvis fan. So she said, "Yeah, the only thing greater would be if Elvis came and had a party with us." So that didn't go over that well, but no, it was a delightful evening, and very nonchalant too. It wasn't self-conscious at all. And well, we continued to correspond back and forth, but the Dead put out 2 albums that were directly influenced by us in that time. The first was called Wake of the Flood, their first original album, and Grateful Dead from the Mars Hotel. Those 2 albums contained material that you could readily see their experience with us and our experience with them. But they too came to an end by 1995. Jerry Garcia died and the band disbanded. So in a lot of ways, my story is discontinued more than it's over. I've continued to write about it. I do think that it's a loss that the counterculture isn't stronger than it is. But you get that from being out on the street. That's really what street people are. They're people who like people and like them enough to go out and look for them, and then commune with them. Just like I'm still doing now. I feel the need always. My current coffee house is Center Supermarket over on 2nd Street and 16th. He's a contemporary of mine from Northeast, the owner of Walt Centers, and I've decorated the store, and the photographs that I've taken since 1980 have become really my occupation as far as the outside world would be concerned. They're always interested to see photos, and I have a permanent landscape exhibit on display at Centers of all the best landscapes along the river here above the falls. And, in the interest of preservation and everything. But again, getting back to the fact that an influx of people changes the reality. You just can't have a city have more and more and more people in it without it affecting the individual's experience of the city, so that, the landscape gets blocked by cars, commuters, and by people out walking. And, I suppose you could say it's inevitable, but I don't see why. People could restrain themselves. I mean, we're talking over-reproduction, not just overpopulation. They didn't get here by accident. And when I entered Edison in '61, there were less than 3 billion people, and now we're approaching 7 billion. So I can tell. And I can see that it makes a difference, that it changes the way people communicate, just like the internet has. People think they're communicating more, when actually they're more and more insular. It's all a lot easier to present like a video version of yourself than the real version. And when I go to coffee houses, it's like we never charge more than a dime for a cup of coffee. In fact, the whole Riverside ran on a pay-what-you-can-afford basis in our opening year or so. It became, in essence, our gimmick. People would come in who would be entertained by telling them that we didn't have prices, that they could determine that themselves. A lot of people couldn't do that. They just freaked out. But now everything is so expensive, you can't go out. I can't, anyway. And hang out anywhere, because everything is money-based. And if that's what holds you together rather than, you know, your desire to be with other people, it's obviously going to be a different thing. You know, it's going to be more like people seeing each other as a status symbol rather than really seeing each other.